Okay, well, I'm Scott Morato. I am associate professor of philosophy, and so I work on in my work in philosophy. Some of what I do is working on political thought and thinking about our contemporary political moment. So yes, and I've been a sort of faculty advisor to the Keweenaw Socialists. So I inherited that position, I think, from Carlos.
Oh,
might have been.
was it?
Yeah, I think Carlos might have been before me, but I'm not sure whether
I
that's
think
true.
you were the first.
Oh, I was the first. Oh,
I think
I'm
you were the first.
the founding.
I think Carlos went on sabbatical.
Right
That's
at the time
right,
when-
right when
somebody was looking for somebody to fill the role. Okay, great. All right. Chelsea.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Shelley, and I'm a professor in the social sciences department and a sociologist by training.
So Kwang Hong, associate professor of marketing. Might wonder why I'm here. Because I
He's
think I
wondering.
might be the target today. Simply because of the word marketing. We'll see how it goes. Good to be here.
The thing that I thought when I was having a conversation with Cameron and Griffin about this week, this slide to the left week, and this wanting to maybe think about a panel discussion, was just the idea of like having a little conversation maybe with some of you and inviting some colleagues to participate in that, just around the idea of alternatives, right? Because the thing that when I think about my own formation as a young activist, when I was a high school student, it was during it was a different world. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. The Sandinistas were in power in Nicaragua, which I remember because one of the things that I did as a high school student was there was this group called Tools for Peace in my high school, and their activity was to like raise material aid to like run past Ronald Reagan's blockade of Nicaragua during the Sandinista period and like deliver everything from educational supplies to tampons to Sandinista women organizations and stuff, and during that period. So that was kind of my senior high school years. That was one of the things I was doing it. But I remember, like, I think of the moment in between that moment and now as kind of defined in really powerful ways by this phrase and I mentioned this to other, and we put it on the poster, of Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, who famously said, you know, in the face of like the collapsing of the Soviet system and the falling of the wall, this idea that there is no alternative. And that phrase now has its own acronym, TINA, and it has its own Wikipedia page. Like, there is no alternative has a Wikipedia page just as a phrase. Because it became so often repeated, both by her and by other politicians at the time and subsequent. And it feels like that idea, that basically what has come to be called sort of neoliberalism as a framework for understanding our political and economic life, but also our personal lives, our educational trajectories, our healthcare systems, our infrastructure, all of this stuff. The idea that the market does it best, and that there are no genuinely public goods. In fact, another famous phrase of Margaret Thatcher was, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals, right? There's only individuals and their families, was how she put it. The idea there just being that basically there's just market actors pursuing their own interests and competing with each other, and that defines the terms of public life and defines the limits of what it's possible to imagine. So one of the things that happened under her premiership in the UK was just liquidating public assets, like the public railways system, which had been, you know, the major mode of transport for many people in the UK, and liquidating all kinds of other things. And at the same time, that was happening in the US, it was happening in other places. In fact, I was also thinking that this week is many historians of neoliberalism as a political philosophy point to the Chile and starting in 1973, so 50 years ago, this week, in fact, was the time when the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende in Chile was overthrown and replaced by a military dictatorship sponsored by various international interests, including this country, and began a period of neoliberal reforms, in which meant you had all these people, educated, Chicago school educated economists working on this, privatizing everything, administering what were called shock therapies to the Chilean economy, driving up interest rates and driving a lot of folks into poverty. And so that's seen by historians, like David Harvey is one who has a book on the history of neoliberalism, as being a defining moment. That was the sort of the model of kind of neoliberal state building. And let me just say quickly something about neoliberalism. So the idea there of neoliberalism is, I mean, there's lots of different versions of it, depending on which political scientists, political theorists you're reading. But one thing that I've heard, you know, from a number of different kinds of perspectives that I think is sort of an interesting way of summing up the idea is partly just the idea that that every value that we have, the value of an education, the value of exercise, is to be understood on the model of economic exchange values. Right? So the idea that return on investment is ultimately the right way to think about your education, for example. It's the right way to think about your joining a gym. It's the right way to think about your life and plan in general, right? That how do I invest and build up my, and this is another great neoliberal phrase, human capital, right? Such that I can, you know, maximize my power to make further investments down the road. So that's one important thing. It's the idea that everything is really to be understood. In fact, there's a great a theorist named Wendy Brown sums it up really well. And she says neoliberalism is best understood as a governing rationality that disseminates market values and metrics to every sphere of life and construes itself exclusively, it construes the human exclusively as homo economicus, right? An economic actor. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is about defending the market, defending the space of that kind of exchange from democracy, right? In fact, this is famously when the Chilean Revolution happened, Henry Kissinger, who was at the time the Secretary of State, was quoted. He wasn't quoted, it was in a document that was subsequently declassified, but he said something like, we can't let an irresponsible people lead their country down the road to communism. Like basically we have to protect the Chilean, you know, economy from democracy. And that idea of like protecting the sphere of economics and markets from democracy is another, I think, crucial idea of neoliberalism. So you end up with trade deals, the WHO, and you end up with, or the WTO, or earlier the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs, and all the NAFTA and various other trade agreements are in a way set up to kind of be like transnational legal frameworks that protect property rights and protect exchange and protect those from incursions of democracy, right? People wanting to turn things into public assets or that sort of thing. So those kinds of themes, the themes that define what theorists call neoliberalism, seem to me to have defined much of the political reality of the last 40 years. And I was thinking at the same time that arguably there are some shifts in that. So like today I was listening to the president of the university giving a talk about a report on the status of the university. And he referred to an idea, and it seems to me he's right about this, but he said something like, you know, one of the things we've noticed about universities, and it defines the context in which we are a university right now, is the shift in attitudes away from thinking of university as a public good and thinking of it as a private kind of consumer good that you buy, you know, you buy for maybe parents who pay for their kids to go and get this thing and build up their human capital, right? And that's been something that defines the situation, and what corresponds to that is decreasing public contributions to keeping universities running, and more coming from other sources, including all of the tuition that you pay, and that often accumulates as massive amounts of debt that people carry when they go back out there into the work world. And so it's true that there's been a trend in that direction, except what's interesting is in the last number of years, there's been some surveys that have shown that that attitude is actually starting to shift, that people are now, when they ask people who should be responsible for university education, starting in about 2010, you're starting to, and the Chronicle of Higher Education reported on this about a year ago, you're starting to see a trend back toward people thinking, you know, maybe government should bear some responsibility for this. And at the same time, things like healthcare, which have largely also, especially in this country, been defined by the notion that this is a private thing that you need to purchase on your own. You know, for the first time, possibly going back to, you know, some of the early Bernie Sanders efforts on this and his campaign, it's now become possible to talk about that as a public good, as something that maybe the public could be responsible for, or that we could do together. And I think that you see similar things around infrastructure conversations, and you see similar things around efforts to deal with climate change, as things where instead of talking about these simply as things that have to be contained by the terms of market exchange, we might be able to talk about those in terms of democracy and in terms of things as citizens, rather than just as consumers and taxpayers, we might be able to actually engage and do it together. So it seems to me that there's at least the possibility that there could be a richer conversation about democracy and the economy and these kinds of goods that have been sort of contained within this very narrow framing for the last 4 decades of sort of just market terms. So that was my idea, is that we sort of maybe talk about this idea of the kind of reemergence of possible alternative ways of thinking about addressing some of these things. And I thought of these colleagues of mine in other departments as people who in their work and research think a lot about these questions of alternatives in terms of policy and kind of pushing back on the traditional ways in which we might think about value and we might think about how to problem solve in the face of some of our contemporary challenges. So I thought that I would invite them to join me at our virtual table here and have this conversation. So I don't know who would like to, anybody feels inspired to take it up from there.
Yeah, I can pick it up from there. I want to pick up particularly on this idea of neoliberalism, and by way of introduction, I think of neoliberalism as individualization, right? That idea that there is no society outside of individuals and their families. There's a really famous article in the world of environmentalism that's something like plant a tree, buy a bike, save the world, right? That you, through your individual consumer decisions, are somehow going to shift the systemic issues. And that's one hallmark of neoliberalism, or the current kind of contemporary global economy. And so what I'm going to start with in my comments might seem a bit counterintuitive or maybe even hypocritical, because I do want to focus on the things that you as an individual can do that I see as contributing to that systemic change. And for me, one of the biggest things that we as individuals can do is to exercise radical decommodification whenever possible, right? So if you can move yourself out of commodified relationships, that is a choice that you can make in lots of different ways every day that I do think can add up to big differences, not only in how we interact with one another, but also how we relate to the broader world. So some examples of things that you might do in that space. One is, if you have extra shit, don't sell it. Try to give it away, right? Like, rather than thinking about your surplus or your excess or your things that you no longer need as an opportunity to accrue market value for yourself, think about them as ways that you can give to others. There's a really robust buy nothing community where we live, and it's a really active space of sharing, right? And one of the rules in the buy nothing community is you don't get to ask how people are going to use the things that you give, right? That when you give freely. And that's something that we can all do more of in our lives, I think, very easily, particularly in this very privileged space, right? I want to acknowledge that we're in an incredibly privileged space, being at a university. We live surrounded by surplus, right? So whether that's, I don't know, making things rather than buying them, finding ways to engage in social activities that are not consumptive activities, right? Like making food together rather than going out to eat, or whatever it might be that you can come up with, finding ways that you in your own lives can practice radical decommodification and stepping outside of market relationships and not treating your colleagues and fellow students and friends as an opportunity for that market exchange, right? So, and maybe that looks like sharing Netflix passwords. I don't know. There's all sorts of different ways that you can do it, right? Whatever your own comfort is. But I also think that as a part of that decommodification, we are tasked with thinking about what is it that we have that we can share that we haven't yet thought about as something that could be shared, right? What kinds of shared systems can we contribute to? And again, that could be very simple things like sharing access to your washer and dryer so your friend doesn't have to go pay for it at the laundromat, sharing access to kitchen tools so that people don't have to go buy their own, but thinking about ways that you can use your own surplus to contribute to a decommodified gift or sharing economy, I think is one of the most radical things that we as individuals can do. And I think it takes effort because it's not how we tend to think, right? We tend to think, I don't want this thing, I'll sell it on Facebook Marketplace, or I'm gonna buy, we're gonna go out as a group of people, so we're gonna buy drinks or food or whatever it is. But there are ways to decommodify our own engagement in the world. And to think about sharing as kind of a core principle, right? And that can be its own form of pushing back, I think, in certain ways. A lot of the work that I do is focused on communities or spaces where people want to change the way that they relate to technology and infrastructure. And so that can look like intentional communities. And some of those are really radical and fun. And I'm happy to talk about labor sharing communes all evening if you want to. But you don't have to move to an intentional community or an eco village to do some of the things that they're doing, right? And again, that might look like sharing rides in your car without asking for gas money, whatever it is that you can do to change the way that you relate to one another, and changing how you engage with commodification, which is a part of the logic of neoliberalism, that it sinks into everything we're doing if we're not being conscious of it, right? That we're not aware of it. When we change that relationship to technology, I think particularly on this campus, it's really important that we find ways to push back on this idea that technology is going to save us, whether that be through environmental crises or economic crises or whatever it might be. My sense is that much of the ways that we are able to exploit other human beings without remorse are tied to our ability to exploit the earth without consideration. And if we see ourselves as separate from the earth-based relationships that sustain our lives, we will continue to engage in those exploitative relationships. Technology actively keeps us separated from the very embeddedness that we have in the ecological relationships that keep our lives maintained at whatever level they might be. And so I think particularly on this campus, when you're thinking about opportunities for critical conversation, just recognizing how deeply embedded this implied idea, this kind of implicit assumption that technology is going to be the thing that saves us, it's really deeply embedded in what we see on campus, and it really contributes to, in my perspective, this separation of humans from the rest of the earth in ways that aren't real, right? Because we're not actually separate from the earth. We are animals that are dependent on earth, just like every other animal. And so thinking about some of the systemic changes that would be necessary to engage in those relationships in a right way. I think one place that I see an opportunity for insertion there is thinking about how we relate to technology and questioning whether or not technology is a tool that is going to help in some way, or whether it's perpetuating a false separation that I think is really at the root of much of the systemic exploitation that we see both with people and with more than human animals and beings on the planet. So I would like to, as we're thinking about this conversation, we're hearing from you, kind of bring in that relationship between social systems and exploitation and earth system and exploitation, and think about how are those things related in the current economic structure that we see, and what are some ways that we could push back on that. So, yeah, I'll start there.
Yeah, now I regret I should have gone second, but yeah, but I think Scott brought up the word activism or activists at the beginning. And I know for sure it's painful because I'm sure I'm the one who inhaled the most tear gas Because I live in Seoul, Korea, nearby subway, not subway, commute train station where all the demonstrations went on all day, all night. Yeah, and it's painful to pursue an alternative. And sometimes it doesn't happen, right? But the pursuit shouldn't stop, I think, right? So I think Scott kind of opened up the conversation with the higher level conceptual abstract conversation, and Chelsea's point is very practical, everyday type of things we can pursue, right? Or try at least. So my plan for the conversation today was to throw in a couple of notions and concepts and ideas and just converse around them. So Chelsea mentioned a lot about technology. We interact, we use, we consume every day, and we are at a technological limits. Then we probably have to think about technology a little from a very different angle. There is a notion called techno-capitalism, right? I think it's kind of well-known notion, I think. So these technological companies and corporations, they experiment on us, right? I think that's a very specific offspring, I would say, of neoliberal thinking, basically. Neoliberal. So technology is experimenting on us every day, all day, and we have become involuntary subjects in that experiment. Think of biosynthetic pharmaceutical companies, right? Social media platforms. We are not their users or customers, we are their products, right? And this technological creativity has to be commercialized, right? And then these companies need resources, if you think about, to commercialize this technological creativity into something that can be sold in the market for economic value, right? Then they have to start exploiting nature, right? So there's another notion or concept I would like to throw in is capitalism as not necessarily opposed to Anthropocene, but this era is dominated by capital to exploit nature for the sake of techno-capitalist society, right? And the problem is nature has been too cheap. It's still too cheap, right? Market has made it very cheap, and we still access nature without thinking about it, taken for granted. And companies have accessed nature almost for free for decades, 100 years. Okay. Then the issue is this externality. Companies have externalized the social cost, the cost at society level, to no one, basically, right? They should have paid higher price for the access to nature, but they haven't, right? So now we are paying the price they haven't paid. That's why we are seeing all these natural disasters everywhere all day, right? On space. You know what happened to Libya, right? You've seen it, right? Then, is there an alternative? Hopefully, right? Then how to pursue the alternative? That's the question. That's the next logical question we have to ask. We know, we see all these problems. then what is the alternative or the alternative way of organizing things, right? So there's another notion of concept I wanted to throw in is prefiguration, prefigurative politics. You just try to organize without any prejudice, very horizontal way, very inclusive way, right? Without a single predetermined objective. That's prefiguration. You have to just connect people in a very rhizomatic way, if you will, right? So I think that's one of the right ways to resist and organize activity if you want to pursue any alternative. And it's very different, and there are different examples of this figurative politics that are successful, one of which is Occupy movement, especially Occupy London, or auto-globalization movement, you're familiar with that. So I think what we need to realize at this moment, at this juncture, is that it's just connecting, decentralized networking. Yeah, individuals, going back to individuals, that was the problem, right? For individuals, for society. Then we start from that particular problem. Individuals can connect to one another in a very decentralized way. I think, I don't know, I didn't really know about this particular group of students. I hope you have thought about ways you can connect with different entities, different individuals. I think that would be one of the most practical ways to move forward. So that's my take on alternative, pursuit of alternative, basically. And it could be still very abstract and up in the air, mumbo jumbo type of thing, but there are examples that give us some hope, right? So I think that's how I wanted to kind of converse around different things. So
I'd like to maybe see about taking the thing that both of you said and then maybe putting a question out there to the group to see what you all think, because I know, in fact, like, I'm thinking about some of the things even that, you know, the one of the sessions this week was talking about you know, electronic kind of, so like giving a lot of the things that the group has been doing is kind of this sort of like mutual aid, community building, kind of figuring out, sharing resources, that kind of stuff. Activity, which seems to me to be kind of related to the things that both of you talked about. And I guess in the things that each of the three of us have said, it seems to me like there's this kind of pull, because I think we recognize, I think we all share probably the recognition that, you know, again, to go back to Thatcher, her remark about, you know, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals, is part of the enervating or the, you know, kind of situation that we're in right now politically, especially in the face of climate change, and especially in the face of, you know, people wanting to address climate change with these kinds of lifestyle adjustments, you know, where we just say, well, just make sure you know, have an electric car or something, which is great. I mean, I'm not, but I feel like those kinds of solutions are not at the scale of the thing that we're dealing with when we're talking about the reality of climate change and where the issues are. And so the question is, how do we start that process? Suphan, I think you got it really well too. Like, just how do we start building the networks that allow for there to be a kind of collective agency? Because just individual choices aren't going to cut it. So we need to do things that somehow start to kind of allow us to respond at this level, that's at the scale of where the problem is. And so it seems to me that is the challenge, because we need to be talking about it in terms of what individual choices and what we can do. We need to have agency. But at the same time, we also need agency that turns into something that can address the critical issues at their stage. So I guess that I see that as being the thing that's hovering in each of the things we're talking about. And I'm wondering, you know, what's your thoughts?
Invite some
Might
thoughts
be,
and
yeah,
ideas.
yeah.
No questions. Thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, sure, yeah. That's right, yeah.
No, one that, one that kept coming to mind for me, when you're talking a lot about kind of the way that neoliberalism emphasizes the individual over the community. And I'm a computer engineer, computer electrical engineer. And so I interact a lot with the internet and, you know, as a youth, but that's one that I see kind of happening in the internet is this extremely dire struggle, almost to the point of a war happening between what's going to define the internet, because it's still growing and changing extremely rapidly. Because what defined internet 1.0 was collaboration. Is there was nothing there, and it was a whole bunch of kind of nerds in their basement figuring it out. And what's been defining internet 2.0 is the ability to market things, right? You created cookies, you created the way to track people, and you made it shiny, and you made it advertiser friendly. And Web 3.0 is really weird because there's this kind of two sides to it that are being fought over. One is turning the internet into a commodity itself with things like NFTs. But then there's the other side with things like the free internet or the Free Technology Foundation, and decentralized platforms, things like Mastodon or Matrix, you know, attempting to replace these corporatized applications and make them decentralized. And I think it's very interesting. Like another one is Venmo. Has really changed the way that people interact with each other as friends. Because what it used to be is you'd go out with friends and you didn't want to split the bill, so one of you would pick up the tab, and the next time somebody else would do it. But now that there's Venmo, you look at the receipt and you tally it up and you do all the math and you split it up and you have to get the numbers right. And that's something a friend of mine who just recently graduated, Aiden, has been kind of in their own life pushing back against, of like, I will not let you Venmo me. I will not let you cover me for this, but next time you pick it up, and attempting to move back towards a kind of sharing based society.
That's very interesting. So Venmo is just one little experiment that uses us as subject. And that experiment was a huge success. I mean, it's still successful and it's gonna stay successful, I think, right? But that counter experiment or experimentation done by your friend, that's the type of alternative we probably have to promote or at least try individually. I think that ties back to what Chelsea just said. I mean, at this individual level, default change needs to be done. It's painful to change the default, and it takes time usually, but sometimes it doesn't take any effort or time. Then, okay, just go to the ATM, get enough cash in your pocket, and pay your friend right away.
Or just trade turns,
trade,
who's
yeah.
paying,
Yeah,
and don't
exactly.
keep track of
Don't
who
buy
bought what.
yourself, give and take,
Yeah.
right?
But I do want to acknowledge a real tension in that, right? That is that sharing systems often rely on a sense of social trust that in our hyper segregated society, we do not see across social differentiations, right? So Dancing Rabbit Eco Village is an example of a place where people who feel like they have extra give to a collective pool, and people who feel like they need can take from that collective pool. No questions asked, nobody sees who's doing what. This is a community of 50 mostly white people who are all choosing to live in this eco village in Missouri. They all trust each other. They have a lot of demographic similarities. We don't have that in our society, and that creates a real limit for our ability to effectively use shared systems, right? So in addition to sharing, I think there's also a charge to go share with someone who isn't already in your social network. Go learn about somebody who is different from you in every way that you can think about, and then try to not commodify that relationship, right? Find a way to decommodify that, create that gift exchange of learning or mutual aid or mutual support out of a relationship with somebody who's very different from you in whatever way you can imagine. Because of our, and think of examples like on campus, we have some really great shared systems, right? We have the food access network, we have the Husky closet, we have places where you could radically decommodify your relationship to clothing and food and receive if you need it. That works really well on a college campus where people have the sense that everybody deserves it and everybody is accessing it in a way that is seen as right, because there's this shared sense of social cohesion or trust. So I think there's a tension there that we have to be able to acknowledge that in our highly segregated society where we don't get to know people outside of whatever class, racial, ethnic, religious, gender, whatever kind of positioning you feel like defines you and your social group, it just becomes much harder, and we don't end up sharing with the people who need it the most. That's the reality of organizing shared systems in that way, I think, is that we don't end up helping the most vulnerable because they're not in the same social circles as those who are most privileged and can share. I think that for me, that's really important.
And that, to pick up on that too, because I think that's, I know that one of the other discussions that was going on this week, it concerned the issue, I think if I remember, the issue of class and race. Stuff, because I feel like this points to, I think, a significant issue about why, for example, healthcare, right? Like this country's an outlier, as you probably know, with respect to
Compared to
healthcare.
Canada.
Well, compared to Canada, and compared to a lot of
All of the countries we compare ourselves
right? Like
to.
we would say it's kind of an outlier. Like there are a lot of different versions of public kinds of healthcare systems out there, and a lot of sort of mixed and hybrid kinds of models. And Canada's single payer system is one, and the British NHS is another, and France and Germany have different things, and Japan. But most other industrialized nations have some version of a thing. And here in this country, like there really is this, or has been for quite some time, this persistent belief that, insurance companies and shareholders, and those should be the people that stand between you and your physician, like that, and that's okay. And then in fact, you're more free in that situation, like as paradoxical as that might seem. And I feel like part of what makes that possible, that kind of, even though it gets worse results, you spend more money on healthcare as a percentage of GDP in this country than any other country in the world. And yet when you look at results like maternal death rates and infant mortality and death from preventable diseases, you get some of the worst outcomes in the industrialized world, or at least pretty lousy ones relative to many other industrialized nations. So how does that keep happening? And I think part of it is exactly this issue of like what has prevented real genuine programs of common good kinds of programs, let's say, is this sense that there's the deserving people and then there's the not deserving people. And I feel like the story about race, the history of race in this country has played a significant role with regard to that.
Because our society continues to make these categories meaningful, even though they are not in any way meaningful, but they have social meaning because our society continues to use them as socially meaningful. In other places, some of that social meaning either never existed or has waned in a way that you can have that social provisioning.
And so it allows this kind of notion that somehow some people are paying for something, other people are getting that benefit, and that kind of ends up defining. I think that was, that's played an important role in keeping these discussions off the table, right? Keeping that there is no alternative kind of thing in play, because that's what we get there.
There's another phrase that's something like people can more easily imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? Because we're so unable to see outside of that system. But I think, again, one of the things I see as a really important defining challenge, I suppose, for a younger generation is linking the meta crises that we face, right? And recognizing that the social crises that we face and the planetary crises that we face are the same crises, right? And that until we can learn to talk with some shared language about those crises as one part of a meta crisis, it will be very difficult to meaningfully address them because they're intertwined, right? The social exploitation and the exploitation of the Earth system, which I don't think it's just about getting the numbers right. I think it's about recognizing that some things can't be turned into numerical values, but that's, you know, there are different ways to account for the value of the Earth system or of relationships that are not accounted for by exploitation.
Yeah,
And I think
sadly
that's really
speaking,
key.
all these prices are all entwined, right? And there must be a culprit. If we have to pinpoint what is the actual culprit, then it's either neoliberal thoughts and thinking or conservative or capitalist thoughts, right? Then the thing is, someone's paying, but those people who pay for certain things don't really get what they pay for, right? For example, I mean, all these gene therapies, I don't know, CRISPR, Cas9, you know, all these technologies have been developed with taxpayer dollars and NIH and funded research. But who's gonna be able to access the gene therapy, right? Then there's money paid, but we can't access that easily. Then where's the money, right? Who's taking that money? You know who, right? Then that's why we want to fight. But when we fight, like Chelsea, you know, pointed to, alluded to, we just should not be based on our value, my value, your value, as a certain people in a certain class, certain region, certain community, certain background, right? So there's this importance arises, the importance of plurality and inclusivity, right? So activism or movement or alternative pursuit of alternative that doesn't include, that's not inclusive of everybody is not really. That's just nothing, and it could be even worse off, I think. Yeah, so I think that's one big thing that we should keep in mind all the time. Yeah.
So an issue I notice a lot that faces especially my peers, it's kind of a persistent sense of doomerism, if you're familiar with the term. We're just looking at how many, problems there are, the equality crisis that we have, and it can be very paralyzing. So I appreciate having a conversation about alternatives. I'm going to ask you a question here, which is that I've got two terms, the gift economy, the library economy, and I'm familiar with those. I'd love to hear how you think that might be.
What was
A gift economy or a
gift
library
economy as an alternative economy.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's something, again, that you can institute at a very, very local level, right? Like in our department, we've attempted to have a library of stuff, right? Like a stuff library. So if you're a new student, but you're renting a house where you need to mow a lawn, maybe a professor has a lawnmower you can borrow. So like those are things that you can establish kind of within whatever organizational space you might occupy, right? Whether it's your educational spaces in a department or a program, or as an employee within an organization, right? So you can build your own sharing economies or kind of gift economies, library economies. I've had success having conversations with people about what they already share. And then, okay, given what you already share, what might you also be willing to share, right? Because sometimes people don't think that they're already doing this, but like maybe Netflix passwords or what, like most people have something that they're already sharing, right? So if you can start with, well, what do you already share that you don't turn into a market exchange, but maybe you're sharing access to whatever, whether it's your passwords for things or, my friend takes care of my cats, but they don't make me pay them, whatever it is. And then, okay, now that we've acknowledged you do share some stuff, what else are you willing to share? And most people, in my experience on this campus, say something along the lines of, I'm willing to share absolutely anything as long as it's not an inconvenience to me. Well, what makes it an inconvenience to share with other people is the transaction costs involved in communication and figuring out sharing, right? If you're sharing a car with somebody, it's totally okay if you work completely different shifts and need it at different times. Really problematic if you don't both need it for the same hour. So there's like a coordination cost that goes into sharing. And if we can figure out a way to acknowledge that cost and then honor it, maybe not in a market exchange, but some other kind of gift economy, right? I think that makes it a lot easier for people to imagine their ability to share, right? Because I think for most people, they're willing to share things, except it maybe gets inconvenient. Right? The other thing that I think is really important in that is acknowledge, there's somebody I work with who says that communication is our #1 sustainability challenge, because in the United States, we do not learn to communicate through conflict. So if you're sharing something with somebody and you're like, hey, I never mind when you use my blender, but could you wash it better afterwards? Like whatever it might be, it becomes really hard for us to communicate through that conflict. And we're gonna have to learn to share things. That's just the only way that we're gonna be able to address these multiple confounding meta crises. So working on our own ability to communicate through conflict and figuring out what that looks like maybe doesn't seem like a systemic alternative, but I think actually contributes to our ability to engage in those systemic alternatives, because sharing will result in some need to communicate through conflict, even if it's over conflict of scheduling.
Yeah, and in relation to gift economy is based on reciprocity. Then what kind of reciprocity is it? That is a fundamental question. What you want in a larger context? You give something to someone or some entity, you get something back, right? Assuming you will get that one day, right? Then what would that be? What would that have to be? In this gift economy, in a larger context, historically, one thing that's missing, that has been missing in society, was power. You give power to some people, but you never get that power back. So that's one problem that has been lingering in gift economy. Everything can be reciprocated, but power. You don't want to give the power you possess now back to anybody. That's the problem, and that's very theoretical, scholarly way of looking at it. But another issue, more market-related issues, sharing economy, gift-based economy, sounds good, but there's always this capitalist corporations try to snatch that opportunity from individuals. Uber,
Yeah, exactly. That's-
Airbnb,
That was the appeal of those things at the beginning, right? Like it was like,
Yeah.
good, we're gonna kind of.
there were already communities
Yeah.
of sharing cars and
Yeah.
houses and spaces. Oh,
We can
some guy in
monetize
a
that.
company, I can make money out of it. I can get some investors and let's start it, right? Then what are you gonna do? You back to square one,
Mm.
pretty much, right? Because you are just co-opted and appropriated. So if you participate that particular sharing economy or gift economy, you're basically contributing to the system you abhor, basically, right? So it's kind of paradoxical. Like, there is always the comeback of the market. So the most seminal article in my field, the title is "Can We Escape the Market?"
There-
The answer was no. Yeah, because why? Because the publisher is
Is an economist?
probably, and so, but more and more people say the answer has to be yes, right? And we know there are different ways to make the answer yes, right? So those things need to be realized and discussed, conversed upon, and continuously. There is no end. There's no end game. I think that has to be realized. There's no end game for either side. I think it's just continuous this making of alternatives, and at the end of the day, it's gonna be a world of alternatives, probably. I can see it right now, like he mentioned about this, what the Harris Internet, and how what kind of alternative can we create and maintain the alternative as the internet, right? But that 5 or 6 or 7 or they'll come up probably, I think.
But part of the challenge, I think, of the situation that we're in is that, the philosopher, social scientist Michel Foucault famously said about neoliberalism that he described it as a political rationality, by which he meant to say, like, it's sort of one of those things that defines our imaginative potential. Like, it sort of says, here's the limits of what it's possible to think is reasonable. And when you're in a political rationality, it's hard to see outside of it. It's hard to see that it is a political rationality. It just seems to define the obvious. And so, like, seeing education, just to take an example that's probably close to all of you, as deriving value from the return on investment, which is something, Obama used that language, like, across the political, what we think of as the political spectrum in this country, which is actually not a very wide spectrum at all. That there's almost agreement on that. By the way, I'll just say I'm just full of Margaret Thatcher quotes tonight. There's so many good ones. But one of the things that she was asked one time what she thought was her greatest political achievement, and her answer was Tony Blair, who was the Labor guy that succeeded her. But she said this is her greatest achievement, was that he basically just kept doing the same thing that she did, even though he was the Labor Party guy. And probably Ronald Reagan could have said the same thing about him. But it's that idea that somehow the limits of what it's possible for us to do is defined in some way that we find it hard to get outside of. Like, it seems that's the issue. And I think, in political philosophy, there's two different theories about, let's say there's many different, but there's a couple different ones that are prevalent right now in the political left of political theory. And one of them is associated with some theorists called Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. And it's very much along the lines, I think, of what Sukunkwan was talking about, the sort of rhizomatic model of, people forming very horizontally what they refer to as the multitude, this kind of people engaged in kind of what they call communicative labor, in the contemporary economy, finding their way to each other and forming a new kind of shared agency. The other model associated with the Argentinian philosopher Ernesto Laclau and a Belgian theorist Chantal Mouffe is called the sort of, as often referred to as the hegemony kind of school. That one says you got to take power. Like, you're not gonna do enough network forming across. You have to seize the levers. And I guess I feel like in this conversation I'm probably a little more on the Laclau kind of side. I sort of feel like, and Mouffe side, in that when I came here to this country, I remember the first time that I pulled out my bank card to buy healthcare, and it felt really weird. Like, it felt unclean. I had not had that experience in my whole adult life up until I was, well into adulthood. And I felt like something shifted there, because to me, and I know in this country, even when people are talking about more distributed, like, some kind of universal thing, there's always this language of, again, who's paying, who's getting, who's taking out, who's getting the benefit. Even the fact that people talk about social programs as what's the term that we use here? Entitlements, right? Like, this kind of way, like this language, which defines the way we talk about these things, militates against a notion of a sharing economy at the level of power, right? Like, at the level of something that and the problem is, I think the way people got out of that, of thinking about healthcare in those terms, and that, which is a kind of limited achievement, but still an important one, in other countries, is in part that they seized the levers at some point. They produced a thing that then enabled this to be shared. And now I think it's a bit counterintuitive for many people in Canada, I think, to think about who's paying and who's getting in healthcare, because there's just this sense that, oh, it's just there. It's just a thing you assume. You go to the doctor, you got a thing, you get treatment. There isn't this sense of like somebody paying somebody, it's just coming out of the tax system. It's kind of, and I think how you get from here to there, has to involve at some point that seizing the levers that enable you to create a system at a political level. It's very, so that, I guess that sharing economy, to go, back to your question, seems to me, I think it's important that we try to practice it in these local ways. I think that it is true that it develops imaginative potentials, a sense of agency, but at some point it has to become a political reality that we achieve through leveraging power. If that change is going to be brought to a larger, kind of level.
Yeah, I think that if we never want to get the power or level of power or the magnitude of power we want to get back, I think that throughout these rhizomatic networks, horizontal networks, I think it goes back to what Chelsea advocates. It's networking with individuals and meso-level communities. I think what they can do is making micro incisions to the current system every day, all day. We can't really make a hard blow to the system. I think we have to admit and realize one day it's just the system is not going to allow that. All we can do is to continuously make this micro system until it realizes I can't really sustain all these micro or a lot of incisions. Hopefully,
Just
right?
5,000 cuts.
Yeah. So I think, I think to me that's kind of the right mentality we might want to keep, right?
I guess I want to maybe push back a little bit, but also respond to that. Like, one of the ways to address the kind of doomerism, right, and feeling like there's nothing that can be done about any of these crises is to figure out how do you insert yourself into the mechanisms of the current political structure in a way that you can make a difference, right? So like learning enough about how city councils work or boards of education work or whatever it might be to make it so that you can participate in those things, because most people who are engaged in the traditional political structure didn't start at the top, right? I mean, they had to start someplace else, and you have to know enough about how it operates or how the laws work or how you write legislation or whatever it might be. So one way you can address it is to actually think about, how do I become someone who could participate, even if my goal in participation is to critique or to tweak the system rather than to just, kind of move it along status quo. But there's also a whole line of work on what Eric Olin Wright calls real utopias, and this idea that if we look for it, there are spaces where we can see kind of utopian action, right? And it's a very, very small accomplishment. I want to acknowledge that. But on this campus, that you cannot go hungry or be cold because there is a place to get food and there is a place to get a jacket, that's like its own little micro kind of achievement, right? That there is this kind of real utopia that a student on this campus doesn't have to be hungry or cold because there's a place to get food and a place to get a coat. Tiny achievement in the broad scheme of things, but we can look at these examples of real utopias and say there are places that are doing things that are aligned with our values. Some of the larger examples are things like worker-owned co-ops, but maybe we see it in places that are prioritizing walkability, bikeability in their urban planning. There's lots of examples that we can say places are making changes that align with shared values around collective goods and collective opportunities and collective cultures of care. And if we forget that, it makes it a lot harder to get out of bed and keep fighting the good fight, right? Because there are places where these things are happening. And so I think it's a both and, right? I think one way that we address the sense of hopelessness or concern is that people need to be willing to participate in the traditional mechanisms of politics to engage in that system, to make change, to wield those levers of power. But also there are examples of real utopias that we can look to, turn to, learn more about, engage with ourselves. there are people in Houghton who are living kind of intentional community-like lives, right? Where they share meals or they share access to electricity or whatever it might be. We can look at those and say, okay, how can we do more of that, right? Like, what does it look like to do more of that in our daily life? While also recognizing that we need this structural change that will require that people who are involved in politics traditionally are also willing to critique and try to change the system of politics.
No, you mentioned, kind of getting your hands, on the levers and getting into, power structures, and I think it's really interesting. Looking at the original intent and a lot of the original designs of how the US's governmental structure is defined, it's meant to be flexible, right? Is the idea behind a federation of individual states that have their own governments, and then below that town, below that, things like that, is that you can have more power at the individual level. And I think kind of pulling back on that of at the local level, organizing in your towns and in your states is an interesting way to kind of use the system against itself almost. Is to bring it back to some of its original intent, or maybe even, use some of its original intent and update it, dust it off, clean it up, bring it into the 21st century. Using these kinds of active modes of organization. And I think you can kind of combine these rhizomatic modes of organization with more direct power through that is kind of collecting, 50, 100 towns. Well, then you have a county, and then you collect 10 counties, you have a state, and you can begin to make pretty big change through these kind of networks of individuals.
I think that, I'll just very quick remark, because that point is something that's really emphasized in the work of philosopher Hannah Arendt, who is a political theorist who really came from Germany and came out during the fascist period in Germany and came to the United States and really had this great admiration for that idea of the Republic. She wrote a book called Crisis of the Republic. And in part, what she thought was a lost potential of the idea of the American Republic was exactly that idea of like that in these local things, you could really generate a kind of agency that was, that had real power, but that had its roots in the experience of like people's lived experience of bodily connection to each other in situations, but that could then be sort of leveraged into power that was real, even at the national level, because of the way that structure was set up. And her worry was that we had sort of lost that sense of that kind of local engagement, and that in fact, so I think it's important, like when I was suggesting about this tension between the sort of rhizomatic model of change versus the kind of hegemony kind of model of change, I don't want that to be taken to suggest that we should all have our eyes on the presidency or something like that. Like, it is true that real change has happened of all kinds politically in this country in ways that began very much from people paying attention to where there are powers, potentials for change at very local levels. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think localization or organizing network, I think that's the first thing that has to happen. But what I wanted to say is that it's kind of, there's always this disconnect. If you think about alternative activism movement, then we are talking about the future in the present. And the only way this projection of the future can become complete is you actually do things, act things every day, all day, doing and practice, right? And it's very cliche, I think, if you will, but there are a lot of areas in your life you can try different things. Try something other than that, right? Try something other than Google. Try something other than using all these FANG products, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. right? There are things we can try at least, or at least we can kind of like redistribute the time and effort we use this benefit to something else, right? So I think that will make our life change, I think, and the overall social life can also change as a result of that, I think. So, and system may change in the end, right? Now, of course, it's not going to be tomorrow or next year, but I don't know. What am I doing as an individual? Yeah, no, I am scheduled to watch the next episode on Netflix with my wife tonight. Can I resist it? Possibly, but I won't dare to. But can I resist my wife's request for another show? I can, I think, right? And can I resist resubscribing next year? Probably, right? It's hard. Can you imagine life without Netflix or Amazon? Very hard.
Yeah.
Good. That's what I wanted to hear. That's the start, right?
All Flex TV. We're everything.
Yeah, so, yeah.
And so can I ask why, because in these different models of change that we're talking about here, and I'm curious about the fact, I guess I've been curious from the beginning, like when I first started talking with some of you, and I found out that there was a group called the Keweenaw Socialists at Michigan Tech, I was slightly taken aback, I guess, because I didn't initially think that that was within the horizon of things that might emerge. But I also recognize that it's true that things have been happening in this country. Like, again, I just got my Guardian Weekly. I think I might even have brought it, which is this paper in the UK, and it's got AOC on the cover, and it's after the Sanders campaigns, like it's possible to use the word socialist in this country now in a way that it didn't seem to be for like many of the years I was younger. And I guess I'm wondering what it is that you folks have in mind in the use of that word, because I think it means different things to different people and I wonder why that word might be itself a kind of lever to get us to imagine other possibilities, and if that's how it's working for you and what that might mean.
I wanted to ask that question myself too at some point.
Yeah.
Because you sent me an email, right?
Yeah.
There was a group of
Yeah,
students.
or Alexandra said the first.
Named Keweenaw
Keweenaw
Socialists.
Yeah.
Is this some kind of spam mail?
Is this a real?
No, it cannot happen. I mean, to me, that was my first reaction. So I was like checking Alex's email.
Is it
really
right?
her
Are all the
real
letters in the right
email.
order?
Yeah, it was genuine. So yeah, please.
So what do you think?
I guess the naming convention for the group kind of stemmed from the shared ideas that we all had that kind of went beyond the traditional scope of the US contemporary political space. And like most college campuses have had college Republicans and college Democrats, and that was it. And
Boring.
yeah,
Super boring.
right. And we kind of realized that what we're trying to achieve with, I guess, our goals or our ideals of what we want to do on campus fall way past that. And I guess,
Way to the left.
yeah, way to the left. And instead of trying to meet in the middle with that contemporary view of politics, instead of like revitalizing college Democrats group, might as well just lay all of our cards out on the table. We are the socialists, and that's what we mean. And if you want to learn more about what it specifically is, you can come to our meetings and learn more about what exactly we're trying to do, because yeah, socialism is, it's not as much of a taboo word as it was, but still kind of rings a few bells and alarms in some people's minds that,
We'll raise the eyeballs.
yeah, it raises eyebrows. So being able to have this dialogue open at all is hugely important. Being able to shift that window to more of what the people are actually thinking, and what the limits of what society can be imagined is. Like you said, neoliberalism kind of imposes a limit on that kind of thinking, but being able to explicitly say things that go beyond that is usually important. Being able to deconstruct the idea that's been so prevalent the past couple decades.
But there has been some disappointment with Latte liberals, Equity liberals,
I would say,
Fang liberals, whichever way you want to call it.
I'm fairly certain the Human Socialists were largely born out of the disappointment of the 2016 election campaign. Season, that a lot of that discontent definitely came there, and you know, the sort of changing of Bernie Sanders' campaign. I do also know that some candidates for the 2020 election, a number of members were campaigning for the primary, and I would say that's probably a firsthand education in how the U.S. political machine actually functions, which is a very radicalizing thing. When your candidate gets very misrepresented by the mainstream media, you're like, this is kind of a really fucked up system that we're dealing with here. And you kind of recognize that it does that to everything that is outside the permissible window. So I do believe that is where a lot of the just a organization came from.
I can say that the specific sort of factor that pushed me to start moving things with this was COVID and George Floyd, and the just incredibly poor response all around, to put it lightly. And I remember in the sort of initial discussions on naming and for the optics in general, there was trying to, with the, for the socialists, trying to be sort of non-sectarian in the way that we presented ourselves, rather than specifically, communists or the anarchists or Marxist Leninists.
Democratic socialists.
Yes, but there was also sort of like, do we want discussion of like, do we want to sort of temper our outward facing expression? There was talk of progressives or something like that. And it ultimately decided to, sort of stick to our guns, so to speak, and not dilute our message, and present that, we are in fact for changing the system, not, merely for improving the existing one. So that's kind of how that shook out.
I just want to point out that a lot of that conversation has been about politics, right? But a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of economic structures, and
Yeah.
those aren't the same thing. But they often get overlapped, right? And I think one of the things I hear, and I want to make sure you also get a chance to tell us, is that some of the motivation for this is the recognition that not everything that's good for capital is good, right? And that like starting from that premise is kind of different than starting from a like, let's have a participatory politics, right? Because you could have a really progressive participatory politics and still think that everything that's good for capital is good. So just I kind of recognize there's a little bit of kind of pull in what we're saying.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
It wasn't around. Actually, a whole community that is kind of apparent. And
what I kind of feel what that does is it's gonna show that, you know, I need so-and-so, I help them do some project. And then they run it down, oh wait, part of this, you know, socialist, and it kind of poisons the verb. Because now they're associating female socialists with this group that is trying to save the church. Or this group that's trying to plant gardens. And it's like, well, how do you look at these people that you've been working with, like, oh, you're terrible now. Social ideas are terrible when you've just been contributing to it without knowing it until you realize that, well, hey, this you're part of this group. I'm sure there's some people out there that probably look at you and be like, oh, can't be friends no more. But I think most people would go, oh, let me rethink this because yes, this whole community garden thing isn't necessarily the most capitalistic.
That's a super important lesson in like all spaces, right? Get engaged with communities in spaces where you are going to engage with people who are different from yourself, right? For me, it's my daughter's school PTO, right? Which I would never have imagined being engaged with. But I think it's really important for those apostolic moms to know a professor who's also nice, right? Who's like not scary and is approachable and also cares about her children. And like we have really great conversations. They change my way of seeing things. I change theirs. That wouldn't happen if I said, that's not a space for me, right?
And I think one of the things that we have to do, and there's a guy, there's a great podcast from folks at Jacobin magazine called The Dig. Daniel Denver is the guy who hosts a lot of the discussions, interviews political theorists and stuff. But I remember him having a conversation with somebody talking about his own tenant organizing in, I think, Rhode Island or something. And he said, I know some of the people that I work with, doing this tenant organizing work, they're probably voted for Trump. And yet when we're working together, they're doing stuff that's actually like pretty radical and haven't put those things together. And in part, that effort is about kind of reversing a thing that I think is kind of weird that's happened over the last summer, where somehow, working class voters have been kind of pulled through culture war kind of politics into a political position that really is not in the interests of bringing about real transformation in their lives, in their material lives. So shifting the conversation back to where can we find this common ground, and where can we start to expose, the transformative potential of that lived experience through engagement. I think there's something really important about doing that kind of work. Yeah, and I would just say that I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is that I feel like maybe one of the things that's gotten this word socialism maybe back in the discussion in this country is that, or maybe what's gone along with it concurrently is like, just thinking about this tenant organizing kind of work and thinking about all the other interesting forms of organizing that are kind of happening. Like you think of the Starbucks, union organizing, like that's not a venue of traditional industrial labor union kind of stuff. And there's other, Amazon too, well, that may be a little closer to traditional, but it's still very different kinds of models of organizing. And I think people are putting into practice ways of trying to stitch together a sense of common interests in a way that I think is extending. And maybe this is where, to go back to the point, Chelsea, that you made, like there is a political register in which we're talking, and then an economic kind of register. And I think part of the thing about what I think is interesting about the answers that some people have given in the last while in conversations I've heard around socialism is the idea of just like extending the principle of democracy into that sphere that neoliberalism kept outside of the discussion of democracy. Like, in other words, you can talk about democracy here, but not when it comes to the economy, not when it comes to the workplace, not when it comes to control of resources, not when it comes to how much say you have over the production process or something like that. And this is about, it seems to me, that kind of reemerges about saying, let's push those democratic venues of debate and discussion back into the realm of the economy. And so I think it's kind of trying to push the boundary between those spaces, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think I mean, one of the things that the contemporary political moment teaches us is that there is absolutely a thing that is society outside of individuals or
Right.
families or markets. And that's why people get involved, right? Is because they feel connected to something bigger than themselves. And it's a challenge to figure out how to shift that recognition into something positive and productive. But we at least have the first step of people recognizing they feel good when they're a part of something bigger than themselves, right? And that's what we see is people feel good when they're a part of something bigger than themselves, even if it's self and socially destructive. They still feel good participating in something bigger than themselves. So how do we take that recognition in that moment and say, okay, now we recognize we feel good when we're contributing to something collective. Let's turn that into something productive. Let's have a conversation about where that could go. I think the other reason for me thinking about that kind of in local engagement and local politics is that it's really working at a local level makes it very easy to see how how others' interest is also self-interest, right? Tocqueville would call it self-interest rightly understood, right? That it's in your best interest if your neighbors are well, if they have what they need, you are better off as a person, right? And it's very easy to see that at a local level. When there are local crises, what do people do? They step in and take care of one another, particularly in very non-diverse communities like our own. But we can see like people are willing to engage in selfless acts because they contribute to selfish well-being. And we can use that at a local level in a way that we can't in other places. I've done some work with an off-grid housing community that really look like kind of preppers, right? They're like totally off the grid and they're building their houses out of tires and they're really self-sufficient. And if you ask them, why do you do this? They say it's because everybody is better, well off and safer if they have what they need to take care of themselves, right? Like if you can produce your electricity locally and you can manage your own waste, like we're all better off if our neighbor is comfortable in their home, right? So just recognizing at this very local level, it's okay we don't need to see self-interest and social interest as poles. They can actually come together, and that happens at very local sites in a way that we might not see in other kind of scales.
Yeah, I think the politics is very temporal, contextual. So I think if the context is not necessarily given to us, we collaborate and participate, and one way to do is to create the right context. I think there are situations and things people don't really care much about politics. Yeah. I can't think of children, right?
But children care very deeply about fairness, right? And I would say those things are kind of the same.
So, I mean, the people in general, they don't really,
Mhm.
that's one of the context people can invite others and get invited for collaboration. I think so, and that's also some kind of local effort that will contribute to greater impact, or dream about, in a larger context, right? So, I learned the hard way. I mean, politics change, politics can't forward to all the things. So I had a good friend who never came out for demonstration when I was in high school and college. And if you do not come out for demonstration without knowing what we are actually trying to do, you have to be in trouble. You're bullied, right? and he just got fed up with all this politics going on for like decades in Korea, and flee to here actually, and came back, became activist, politician. So it's different. I mean, he hated all these things.
Yeah.
So I learned it hard way.
It is the thing that I mean, raising the issue about the sort of doomer kind of thing, like it is, I would say that it a common experience, my sense is now is a real crisis of agency, like a feeling, where do I take hold of the things that, and I think that, those are really pretty crucial questions to be asking. And, you know, it does have to be rooted, as you know, I think that what you have said in something experiential. You know, it can't be too abstract. It has to be, you know, you have to have the sense that you get together with other folks, you have a kind of power there. Which is why I think that these, you know, some of the stories about the union organizing of Amazon and warehouses and Starbucks are pretty inspiring, because the people who didn't feel any agency started to feel it in those moments. They started to develop a sense, oh, we have this interest in common, and it's an experiential liberation from there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals. Like, you find your way back to that through something where your thing is articulated onto a bunch of other people's experiences, and then new potentials are unleashed. So I think it's great the way, you know, I mean, I know that the group's been involved in working with the tenant issue and stuff as well, which in this community is probably a good place to be engaged. And I think that it's interesting to me the way that the things that you've, you know, taken hold of as a group, in part because you're not sort of limited by the horizon of just thinking about electoral politics and which party is gonna, you know, and how do we, but rather like engaging at this level of like trying to build networks of agency. That to me is pretty good way to engage. So.
Yeah, and I would add to that, even like, don't. There's a whole theory of action that says what we need to do is change how people behave, and that's how we change their minds, right? So like, don't worry so much about trying to change people's minds. Give them opportunities to put the phone down and shut the computer and actually experience something different, because that's how people change their mind, is they go experience something different, right? And I've seen this again in the context of eco-villages. People after 3 weeks of pooping in a bucket wonder why we ever flush drinkable water down a toilet, right? But when they move into the community, the first thing they say is the hardest thing about living here is going to be pooping in a bucket, right? Like, because it's so different than anything you've ever done before. If you put yourself into situations where you do things that are radically different than your other kinds of experiences, your mind will change. You don't have to have new information, new knowledge, somebody giving you new values. It's the new experiences that change the way you think about things. So as you think about your own role in creating those alternatives, like, you don't have to spend your time wondering why you can't change people's minds. Give them those experiences where they see you helping, and then have a conversation with a socialist, right? And like, the experience changes their mind, not the information that you give them about the evils of capitalism, right? Like, that's not what's going to do it.
It's only easy now because we can provide them with VR devices, so they can actually experience how it feels like pooping in the bucket, right?
Maybe we'll back that to the incidental.
That's what I was gonna say, right?
Do those have smell yet?
I'm just ask Elon Musk.
Are you sure about touching grass? Because I believe that's the term we use for largely what comes to
Okay.
I see.
Please go outside and touch.
Yeah, just do something
Look at the
grounded,
sky.
right?
Literally anything that's not being thermally hot.
Yes.
Yeah, touching grass.
Indeed.
Is that like a Keweenaw socialist phrase, or like a thing kids say these days? Okay, all right, thank you for teaching
I like
that
that.
new phrase. I love it.
The idea is to kind of go out and experience the world outside of your screens.
Yes.
You've had a bit
Material.
too much screen time.
Material and
Yeah.
organic
It's not
reality.
just too much time, it's too much debating
Yeah.
culture war politics.
No, so
Yeah.
everything's contained
Yeah.
in that little thing, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Politics, economy,
Yeah.
relationships. Future is contained in there too, right? Past is contained in there too, right? I get the memories on Facebook 10 years ago. Fuck, I don't remember any of that. I posted, right? I don't have to be reminded, but I'm constantly reminded of what I did 10 years ago, right? So past, future, money, friends, relationship, yeah, everything's in there. Maybe that's where we have to start, everybody, right? Just break it somehow.
Well, yeah, everything's in there, and yet none of it is real all at the same
But
time,
it's
right?
also-
Because the grass is real.
Yeah, but it's very interesting. You say
And
that
Tom is
because
weird too.
there's a philosopher, famous Edmund Husserl, who says something about like tradition is the forgetting of origins, and the idea that somehow like a certain amount of forgetting is necessary to establish institutions, practices, political life. Like you can't just be fetishizing the original thing. And in a way, like that's the interesting thing about that. I didn't think about that, but like you go on your phone even and you'll get your photo thing, will come back up and it's like, yeah, I probably didn't need to have that thrown back in my face all the time. Like sometimes the past needs to be past. It's an interesting thing.
It's capitalism without capital. In other words, there is nothing tangible.
Yeah.
Tangible things do not sustain capitalism. Everything became intangible. Vinyl records, food collected. Other than that, is there anything that we, like, that's actually really, really tangible? No, not really. It all, digitized, right? And everything's in there, and everything happens in there, right? And, we're participating voluntarily, involuntarily, in the global scale experiment every day, all day.
And it does reduce politics to these culture war kind of moral kinds of things.
It gets twisted.
And when, I did want to say, related to touch grass, there's actually, kind of two terms that are interesting, kind of almost pathologizing, is, chronically and terminally online. Is chronically online is spending too much time online, but to where you can pull yourself away. Terminally online is a sense of being stuck to the internet in a way that you cannot remove yourself. You've kind of dead-ended into this, and it's kind of slung as an insult, but also used as like, almost a self-diagnosis, like I need to get out. Right.
I'm gonna start calling our teenagers that. They ask me often, like, when will I stop having screen time limits on my phone? And I'm like, when you can enact them yourselves and they no longer feel like limits and just the reasonable thing to do, right? But that thinking about our engagement in those spaces and the addictiveness of those spaces, right? I guess for me, it's important to point out that is by design, because if you are distracted, you will not be engaged in the real world politics, right? And so it's not just like a convenience that it keeps you connected. It is by design, and the design is there to keep you from engagement in real world alternatives.
Tons of money. Boxes. Like or like any kind of
I'm sorry, games of what?
loot boxes.
Oh.
Like like game skins or game weapons, real money going for digital stuff that if they don't play that game, they lost that money. So that keeps them in the game longer. And like you're saying, if they're in the game longer, then they're not connected to what's going on outside the game.
Or meeting anyone who has a different set of life experiences or interests in real life where you change the way you think, right? I mean, that's.
And where those differences, and I think a crucial thing is it's where those differences, you may encounter people with different worldviews online, but where that encounter is not mediated by bodily recognition, right? Like so when you encounter people in a culture war, in an online kind of context, it's very easy to just deal with these as abstract kind of postures and identities, rather than to deal with the fact that, oh, here's a person who disagrees with me, but who's actually living vulnerable body like I am, and whatever that might mean.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, indeed, yes.
I
would also suggest that some of the ways that we can move beyond some of that polarization, at least I think, and in some of my experience, is to find tangible goals that exist outside of your particular individual values or politics, right? And I've seen this in my own life. I had a couple of years ago what I called my do-it-yourself goat milk co-op, where people were coming to my house to milk my goats so that I didn't have to every day. And it was people from very wildly different walks of life, right? Like one person was showing up with their NRA sticker on their car. Another woman asked me about my vaccine status before she would participate. We all had very different politics, but everybody showed up on time. Nobody skipped a day. Like we were committed, right? And the reality is people can be committed to shared causes, regardless of what they think about the stuff kind of outside that cause, right? And if you can make those moments of social cohesion or connectiveness, it makes it a lot easier for then you to work together, right? That you can say, okay, you can borrow my jar this week because I know you'll bring one next time, whatever it might be. It just makes it much easier, right? So again, to me, it's like, don't lose sleep over people not thinking the way you do. Find opportunities to engage with those people in shared goals or shared activities, where it doesn't matter, right? Because it doesn't matter what you think about vaccines if your goal is to grow a garden together, right? And to share that food and to spend less money on your groceries. And we can find those opportunities. I think our like political structure and the way we talk about it in the media suggests to us that that's impossible, right? That we're so polarized that we can't possibly work together on common goals. But at the very local level, and when it comes to like decommodification and subsistence, there are a lot of opportunities to work together where it doesn't actually, like, you can change what people think just by doing it rather than even talking about what people think.
Yeah, and I think commitment is required, and there, wherever is happening, there has to be at least one committed person, right? And that has to be you, Chelsea, right? So to achieve that shared goal, right? So commitment. Another name for commitment is pain.
Yeah, maybe one thing I might just throw out there to add to this, and I don't know whether it's different, because I don't want to be speaking for our panel here on this, but because I think there's one other maybe inflection of this that I would want to throw in there too, that I think, and this goes back a little bit to this political theorist Chantal Mouffe that I mentioned earlier. Like, she says that one of the difficulties, because I worry a little bit, I'll just say about, sometimes I think that the diagnosis of our political crisis or political challenges of our moment as being a question of polarization. And I think, yes, there's a certain sense in which that's right, but I think we also might want to be careful with it. She makes the point, and I think this sounds right to me, that part of the issue is that the conflicts are no longer over the real political issues. The conflicts are over, again, in this culture war kind of context, in these sort of moral panic kinds of situations, the conflicts become over the identity issues. And her argument is that really there are conflicts. There are real conflicts. Jeff Bezos's mode of life is not compatible with, and his role in the economy is not compatible with that of his workers, right? Like, there's a real conflict there, and that needs to be sorted out in the political sphere. And there's real fights to be had in those kinds of spaces. And in some ways, those things are actually not the ones that are dominating political discussions. So to say the problem is polarization is right only in the sense that we're polarized over things that are not actually the things that maybe we should be polarized over. But there are some things that we might find ourselves polarized over if we were actually having real political conflicts over modes of life that are compatible with shared well-being, human flourishing. We might find ourselves in conflicts with certain vested interests, and those would be the real fights that might be worth having. So I sometimes think, I remember this coming out after, say, we were talking about the 2016 election. I can remember, like, shortly after, having a discussion with a bunch of people, and some people were saying, about how polarized we were. And I remember thinking, I kind of think we need some fights. We just need the right ones.
Yeah. And as an individual, as a subject, this long held experiment. Another thing that, related to everything we have talked about, another thing I feel every day as an individual is that another thing that neoliberalism has done to individuals is that we have to control ourselves. We have to responsibilize ourselves. We have to stay responsible, stay aware, stay conscious and conscientious as an individual, and that's the projection of the future citizen. And we agree to that to a certain extent, but it has become just too much. You are responsible for your health in this country, period. That's why there are so many gyms, in this little small town. Right? That's why, I don't know, I lost count, right? And we have to internalize all these conflicts, political, economic, cultural, right? We have to internalize and somehow make sense out of all these things internally. That's our responsibility as being a liberal citizen. And we have just become very, very, how would say, politically without our own consent, right? One of the reasons is that we see things right here, right? All day, every day, we read things, people say things, sometimes we say things, right? So I think that this neoliberal responsibilization of individuals is what actually shuts us up. If you're responsible, stay calm, right? Don't stir the pot that's still just boiling just okay, right? So I think that's another aspect I feel every day. Everything's your responsibility. Does the state do anything for you? No. They say they do, but not really. But who's doing anything for you? It's all you, right? That's another aspect of neoliberalism I live every day. Yeah.
There is a political theorist, in fact, I think I brought her book because no, maybe I did, I was gonna. Wendy Brown, who has a great book called Undoing the Demos, and it's, I think the subtitle is like Neoliberalism Stealth Revolution or something, and it goes to a number of different domains, education or whatever, about how and she uses this word quite a lot, responsibilization. Exactly, it's like sort of downloading all of the responsibilities, education onto individuals as consumers. You must buy this thing and build up this human capital or you're going to be screwed in the marketplace, right? And as opposed to thinking about common goods, where we think about education as a shared thing, shared enterprise. You guys, we have talked for a good long time, and we should probably wrap this thing up.
And I have Netflix.
I was gonna say,
shows.
Yeah, there's a Netflix. Somebody has a date with Netflix tonight, and we better get to it.
I just want to say in response to that, that one of the things I hear in that is that something that's really radical that we can do as people is to try to push outside of that individualization and to recognize the system, right? And that recognize how the system shapes you and your opportunities and others, and having some empathy for that and recognizing kind of the systemic challenges that people might face, or just recognizing the system as it is, right? And that's something that we can all do in our own lives, is to try to push back against that kind of individualization.
Yeah.
And we all do it, right? Like I might do it too, where I judge somebody as, what's their individual situation that got them to this point, right? And so just recognizing that if we want to think systemically, that means having the empathy for ourselves and for others to place ourselves within that system and to recognize the way the system impacts us and the other human beings that we might be quick to judge or to evaluate or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And that was, what the sociologist would say.
There you go.
Thanks.
Yeah. You got it. Thank you for letting us come and talk to you.
Next time we do it over a pint.